Fest 60th anniversary of Mothra panel. I am your co-host, Kenton. With me is your other co-host,
Jason. What's going on?
So again, for the bazillionth time during the course of this Daikaiju Fest, what we are doing with these anniversary panels is we're just celebrating the film, sort of re-reviewing them, trying to discuss whenever possible, kind of at least Western fandom's general stance is on a particular film and any sort of legacy that we believe said films have. No behind the scenes, no production stuff. Once in a while, that stuff may creep in for context purposes, but otherwise, we've covered a lot of these films before in the past. Go check out some of those previous podcasts. But also, there are just other resources out there on the internet that are just going to be better in terms of covering all that. So here, it's more of about an acknowledgement and celebration of these anniversary films, because there's been a lot this year, and in fact, there's quite a few that we're not even going to cover during this year's Daikaiju Fest. And so, with that being said, Jason, kick us off with 60 years of Mothra.
So, 60 years, hard to believe. Yeah, as far as Mothra goes, I think our first time seeing this movie, I think it was Monster Vision. No?
We rented it from the local video store.
I could have sworn that we saw this on Monster Vision many years
Nope.
ago in the mid '90s, but I guess the video renting scenario is the case. So obviously you kind of know basically our first viewing of this. So with Mothra, the 1961 version. It's kind of separate from the trilogy from the 1990s. I'm not sure if they're tied in with one another. I'm doubting that
Nope.
they are. But yeah, with the original Mothra, obviously it's sort of kind of going along with the solo kaiju films of that whole late 50s through the 60s there during the time of the Godzilla films and everything.
Golden era of monster films or kaiju films.
Yep. And I would say, out of all the solo kaiju films during this time, besides not counting Godzilla, Mothra is basically the most popular one out of the bunch there. And
You think
with
so?
That, says second most popular kaiju character after Godzilla.
Well, the kaiju character itself, not
Yes.
necessarily her solo film.
Yeah, for this viewing of Mothra, if I can remember, it's been, gosh, there's been a lot of films that it's been years for me since I've watched them, and this is one of them. If I can remember, it's one of the good solo kaiju films outside the whole Godzilla uh, films and everything, and you get a lot of the notable cast members such as Kenji Sahara, Akiko Hirata, and then you got the Shobijin twins in here.
The Peanuts.
Yep, and then you got Haru Nakajima in there, and just
Jerry Ito.
and
Frank
Hiroshi
Sakai.
Koizumi. Yeah, you got kind of the A-list actors and actresses during this time here, and just from the story standpoint and everything, it's a really good film, and something with Mothra being mostly kind of the good kaiju and everything throughout. But this one, it kind of makes Mothra a little bit kind of in between a little bit, or just kind of misunderstood from the story standpoint and everything. But it's a really uh, good film. Just yeah, I really can't think much of anything on this one here.
The one thing about Mothra, as opposed to what we get with a lot of the other kaiju within kind of the Godzilla universe, is Mothra is definitely more in the fantasy realm. And all of that, of course, is obviously originated here. And every time Mothra has shown up in a Godzilla film, there is always that element of fantasy. Um, during this Daikaiju Fest, depending upon how Jason has edited this whole thing, whether GMK comes before or after this particular panel, we talk a little bit about that. You know, there's definitely a fantastical element within that film, but that film is a slight exception because the overall story there is already rooted in a fantastical element. Whereas basically any other Godzilla film in which Mothra shows up, any fantastical element is basically rooted within her and her character. For me personally, I do like the movie. I guess I'm not as in love with it. This is one where I remember when I first saw it many years ago that I was sort of in the middle on it. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it either. I thought it was fine, but I was expecting maybe a bit more from it. And then as the years have gone on, you know, when we were able to get our own VHS copy of it, like 6 or 7 years later, and then I bought, you know, my own DVD version of it a number of years after that, and then just been able to watch it more and more over time, including relatively recently here. Um, I've come to a point where I look at this film, and even though it's called Mothra, and Mothra, of course, plays a big role in it, especially late in the film, this isn't really a monster film per se. Even though, yes, a monster does come in and play a big role at the end in terms of how certain events unfold. This is a strange movie that way. If anybody is familiar um, with certain American science fiction horror films from, let's say, maybe the 40s through the 60s, you occasionally see this, especially in a lot of B films, where any sort of creature or what have you, um, the movie's maybe named after it or kind of hints at something like it, but the creature itself doesn't really play much of a role until the end. Maybe you see bits and pieces of it, kind of like you do here with Mothra. And sure, there's kind of that big scene in roughly in the middle of the film with the Mothra larva, you know, in the Pacific attacking the self defense force and all that. That's, you know, kind of the exception of it. But then towards the end, yes, you get more of this grand Mothra deal. But it's mainly about kind of an adventure story, really. You get um, this this promoter of sorts, played by Jerry Ito, Clark Nelson, who's out to make a bunch of money. He's a big shot guy. Infant Island is discovered, where by and large it was a victim of atomic radiation, but then there's kind of this utopian spot kind of in the middle of the island. They find these two fairy girls, the Shobajin, played by Yumi and Emi Ito, and they're kidnapped. In the movie, more revolves around trying to get the girls back. And yeah, kind of in the background, there's kind of this idea where if we don't return them, this god Mothra is going to come back. But our protagonists do not see Mothra for the first time until, like everyone else, Mothra comes to the mainland. Otherwise, it's just more about the right thing to do is to take these girls out of Clark Nelson's captivity and just return them. And that's really what it's about more than anything else. It's sort of, you know, a rescue story built in with kind of
And
this subtext of commercialism and all that. And Mothra plays more of a role right at the end.
and the whole story that you just kind of briefly went through, it's basically kind of the kind of a similar situation or kind of similar story setup to King Kong, for that matter, such as Shinichi Sekizawa, who's the screenwriter for this. He kind of uh, patterned the versions of the story after Kong, and as well as Gojira, and he also based the whole story off of a serialization from a magazine that's called The Glowing Fairies and Mothra. So, from what Kent has mentioned, it's kind of the similar situation that we see in the original King Kong film.
Yeah, I mean, again, anybody who's familiar um, with the birth of Godzilla, I mean, King Kong played an instrumental role in the inspiration for creating Godzilla. You had mentioned like the cast earlier. I want to say, really, to be perfectly honest with you, first off, I just want to quickly get this little thing out of the way, and then I want to get more into the cast. Whereas, in terms of kaiju action here, the kaiju action I think is fine. It's decent. I think the Mothra larva suit, which is the biggest suit so far that has been produced, at least kind of within the Godzilla universe, looks terrific. But I'm kind of disappointed, even all these years later, kind of in the Mothra action. I just don't. I've never really felt like it was as gripping and as entertaining as what you would find either in Gojira or Rodan, even Varan. Even though Varan was even more confined to a smaller area, I believe it was at Haneda Airport at the end of that film, and they even used some stock footage from the original Gojira for parts of that ending. Um, but getting to the cast, I really love this cast. I mean, you got Frankie Sakai, you got Kyoko Kagawa, Hiroshi Koizumi, Ken Hirara, Jerry Ito, Yumi Nemi Ito, Takashi Shimura, Kenji Sahara, Akihiko Hirata. Robert Dunham plays a very small role at the end. Um, this is a wonderful cast, and kind of blending in with my thoughts on the story as well. I As time has gone on, as I've become older and more appreciative of human drama, I do find myself getting more involved with the story. And part of that, again, first and foremost, kudos to the writing, but at the same time, too, kudos to the acting. You get when you get good actors who get in there, not only deliver the lines well, but really just through physical mannerisms and what have you, they're able to these wonderful characters. Jerry Ito, for example, is a huge son of a bitch in this movie, and I've always heard stories about Jerry Ito in real life was just this major sweetheart of a person, and if that is true, and I do believe that he was the sweetheart of a person, as many people have said he was. That's amazing that this sweetheart of a person ends up being this gigantic asshole in this film that you love to hate. And that just tells you the kind of acting that you get in this film. I do get involved in the story. It's not the greatest story, but because of the acting, I'm more invested in it. And it's kind of jarring at points when you sit down to watch and realize there's a giant monster in this movie. And the fact too, it's named the title of the movie is named after the giant monster. And the giant monster really doesn't come into play till towards the end of the movie by and large. So this cast is really tops. I mean, it is an incredible cast. Um, and I love Rodan. In fact, I like Rodan a hell of a lot more than I do like Mothra. But I will argue that this cast here is significantly better than what we get even in Rodan, and that was a pretty good cast as well.
Yeah, as far as the cast goes for me, and yeah, I think that they have quite a bit of good chemistry with one another, and like when it comes to a lot of the people that are really nice in real life, they always turn out to be really good as far as acting as some kind of asshole in a way. You always That always tends to be a pattern from what I've seen in a ways. Such, you know, if you have some like an actual asshole in real life trying to play as that, it tends to be a little bit forced in a way, but I digress. But yeah, the cast, the list of the cast members in this, even though you get some of the same people in this movie that you do in the Rodan one, I would say, in my opinion, I think that they're sort of on par with one another as far as the cast and how they portray their characters within this movie. But in my opinion, I would say maybe the Rodan one is a bit, just a tad bit better than this one here, but it's still really good in my opinion.
And when it comes to effects work, I would argue this is some of Eiji Tsuburaya's best work. I know we talked about it with Rodan in this Daikaiju Fest, and again, depending upon how Jason edits this whole thing together, when you do get a chance to see that panel, we talk about how arguably those were some of the best effects for even that time. The great work continues here by Subaraya. And again, like I said, with that gigantic Mothra larva suit, that is incredible. And the fact that the details on the miniatures and how the buildings crumble, um, this isn't necessarily special effects, but the cinematography surrounding a lot of the capturing of the destruction as well. But then you have these gigantic model sets with when you see how big that Mothra larva suit is, kind of right near the head where the larva suit is at its tallest, it is as tall as Subaraya himself. And Subaraya, I'm probably taller than what he was, and I'm 5'11. But still, like you're looking at a suit that's probably between 5.5, pushing 6 feet in height. And that's a big ass suit. And when you see some of those shots, especially from above, sure, maybe there are some miniatures in those shots, but to me, it looked like there were some shots of the actual actors inside that Mothra suit going through. And if that is indeed the fact, you're talking about expansive sets that
Mm-hmm.
were made. I mean, it's just from a special effects standpoint, a really well executed film that looks terrific in every conceivable way. Sure, when it comes to the Shobajin in a few spots, yeah, it's very obvious that they kind of look like Barbie dolls in a couple of earlier scenes when we see them on Infant Island. There are some scenes too with the compositing where you kind of see a little bit of the seams that I can kind of forgive by and large, especially when the vast majority of the effects work is done so very well. And I really love the effects work. And this is part of the reason why this particular period that Mothra is in, which is kind of in the middle, maybe even slightly towards the latter half and of the golden era of Kaiju.
Mm-hmm.
It's because you got the acting, you got the stories, you got the inception of the Kaiju Eiga, and you have these incredible effects that uh, gradually, yes, technically, even throughout the 70s are kind of getting better, but due to slash budgets, there's not much they can do, and therefore the ability to make any sort of progress is severely cut back and limited. But this is the era. I mean, again, I agree with a lot of people that if you're looking for some of the best Kaiju Eiga, you definitely look kind of within this time span. Is everything perfect? No. In fact, I talked about a couple things just a moment ago. But by and large, a lot of it's really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the visual effects, uh, basically you don't get like the actual special effects, with the beam rays and everything with this movie, except for like the masers and that sort of thing before the Mothra larva hatches out from the egg and then becomes, the adult version of the Mothra. But yeah, it's really heavily like the practical effects version, and then of course you get the matte screen for particular things, especially the Shobijin. But with this movie being 60 years old this year, uh, I would say, in my opinion, even though that there's some, you get some of the scenes with the matte screen and maybe some other things here and there throughout the movie when it comes to the visual effects. I think, in my opinion, with it being made in 1961, just a year before King Kong vs. Godzilla, I think it's still has aged pretty well for what it is. Um, and I think if I can remember the DVD, I think I do have the DVD version of this one, but with um the the look of the film and everything, I think it was maybe a bit grainy here and there, but I think it's still aged pretty well. Not quite as well as Rodan, which was made a few years beforehand, which that in itself, and I've mentioned it before, that that film has aged pretty damn well for how old that movie is. But I think this film has aged, I think it's right up there with Rodan as far as aging.
I think it's aged well, but again, I think when you're talking about overall enjoyment, a lot of it's going to depend on what your opinion of Mothra is, and also just kind of how you feel about fantasy type films. For me personally, I'm not a huge fantasy film guy. I don't necessarily care for the Lord of the Rings films. I can appreciate some of the incredible quality that goes into them, but I've seen all three of those films, the extended versions. I've seen them all once, and to be quite honest, I don't want to see them again. It's just not my. It's just not my deal. They're fine. I just don't think they're these masterpieces that many other people claim. It's my opinion. Um, but
What?
but at the same time, too, was my opinion of Mothra. I like her, but I don't love her like a lot of other fans do. There are a lot of fans out there where, indeed, yes, Mothra is their second favorite kaiju. I like her, but I'm not in love with her. And as a result, um, to me, this film, or put a ranking of my favorite kaiju films from favorite to least favorite, it's probably going to be in the middle. But at the same time, though, too, as I stated earlier, this is a film where it's a little odd in terms of its structure, because unlike Gojira, unlike Rodan, although Rodan had its own deal as well, but the Mega Neuron stuff did play into the Rodan part, and technically here too with the kidnapping, it plays into Mothra. But I feel like it's comes off a bit more stilted and slightly more whiplash inducing,
Mhm.
simply because Mothra plays a bigger role more at the end of the film than she does at other moments. Sure, we hear about this Mothra and all that, but by and large, this is a fantasy adventure film that is about saving two Shobijin that are kidnapped from their island and trying to get them back from this greedy businessman who is just looking to exploit them in the worst possible way because it's against their will. So that's kind of makes sense. To me, this is more of a rescue adventure fantasy film. Rodan, yes, it kind of starts off with the cave mine, but it builds up to the Rodan thing. Yeah, it kind of builds up to Mothra here too, but it's not as smooth of a transition. It's almost as if Mothra was kind of thrown in there almost at the last minute. That's how it feels, even though I know that's not the original idea, but that's how it is executed.
Hmm. And when it comes to Mothra, and uh, as stated earlier at the beginning of this panel here, that I mentioned about how the way that Mothra is portrayed in this film, were through the majority of her appearances in the Godzilla films and in her trilogy in the 90s there, that she's more or less, on the good side of the humans, whereas this one, you can say that she may be good on the side of, trying to rescue the Shobijin, or maybe just kind of in the middle, that sort of respect, as far as, destroying, you know, laying waste to this city. Was it Newkirk City, which is a made up city there? But
In Rolisica, which is supposed to represent both Russia and the United States.
yeah, and
We're a bunch of greedy bastards.
but yeah, in this one, you can kind of interpret her what side that she may be on, good, middle, misunderstood, whichever, but in that sort of regard, the way how she's sort of betrayed in this movie is kind of a bit mixed in a ways, and it just feels a little bit off and kind of not quite her character that we're used to throughout the majority of her existence. Because this is basically the only time where, you know, what side or how she's betrayed in this solo film of hers, even though that she doesn't come in until like the last 10 or 15 minutes of it. Uh,
It's longer than that.
it's it's a bit my
It's
feeling towards
ambiguous.
my feeling towards it is a bit mixed on her betrayal in this movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's very ambiguous. I think on some level it's meant to be that way because, on the one hand, yeah, like everything that the humans have tried more or less doesn't hasn't worked. And then at the same time, you kind of reap what you sow. And so you understand why Mothra's coming in to do it. But then you're kind of going, okay, well, you're destroying everything else in your path looking for them. Yeah, I mean, I think it's designed to be ambiguous. It definitely, like you said, is different in terms of her portrayal in future films. Her very next film, which is a few years later, in Mothra versus Godzilla, it is different. Her egg washes ashore in Japan. The Shobijin come to Torahata and the Kumiyama, and they don't want to give the egg back. They claim it as theirs, and Mothra just kind of flies off shrugging her shoulders, more or less. I mean, it is different. Whereas if you took the Mothra from this film and inserted it in that film, this Mothra would have just said fuck it and would have leveled Japan to get her egg back. So it is different. And I think obviously when you go through movies, anytime you have a continuation of a character over a series of films, on some level you're going to get personality changes, because what you get in the first movie, yeah, it probably is what you think the character is going to be and maybe forever be. But sometimes too, you don't realize you're going to have this character return in X more movies, and depending upon circumstances and depending upon how overall you want this character portrayed with other returning characters such as a Godzilla that will continue to have many more films himself, that starts to change things. And as a viewer, you just got to go with it, because otherwise you start thinking about it, yeah, you're going to hurt your head and you're going to end up getting pissed off for no real reason.
Hmm. Yeah. As far as the score goes, this is done by a person that I'm not quite familiar with, or to all of us, we're not quite familiar with, by the name of Yuji Koseki. Um, I'm not quite familiar with the person, and from the looks of it, he's only done at least a few scores from what I'm seeing here, and apparently, this film actually, according to this list, was his last one. But yeah, other than that, as far as a score, I'm not too familiar with it. I would have to go back into um, watching the movie again whenever I whenever I get the chance to. But he is the one that did start the whole Mothra song, which all of us are very familiar with, and is sung by the Peanuts and everything. So, with that, I'm guessing you've probably seen this movie more recently than I have. And as far as a score, if you can at least kind of get a familiar with it, what are your thoughts?
Well, and I even own the two disc CD of this as well. It was released, gosh, like I think in 2017. You can go purchase that on arcsquare.net. It's a good score. It is different. I always forget that uh, Koseki does this score, because I always thought Akira. Well, I don't want to say I always thought. I always just sort of forget that he does it, and as a result, have assumed Ifukube did it. Because this isn't what my most watched kaiju film. I do watch this every once in a while, um, but Koseki's score is, I would argue, in some cases similar to what Ifukube does, but of course it is his own style. And um, as a result, I think the score for this is pretty good. I don't think it's great, but I think for what is trying to be portrayed here, it works. Um, yeah, he's very much responsible for the Mothra theme or chant, however you want to call it. Um, it's argued by a lot of fans that Ifukube took that particular track and improved upon it. I would argue by and large he did. Um, but this is a pretty decent score. I think not only does it complement the film well, I think even as a standalone listening experience, it works fairly well. It's a decent score. If you haven't been able to obtain the CDs for this, I would suggest going out and purchasing them, because it I think it's pretty good. I don't think you're going to necessarily be wowed over it unless, again, you are either just a huge fan of this film and or Mothra. But I think I would say if I had to rate the score on its own out of 10, I would say it's probably between a 7.5 and an 8.
Okay. Um, yeah, with that, I can't think much of anything else unless if there's anything that we're forgetting to touch upon when it comes to this film.
Legacy. I mean, has this film at all left much of a legacy? And I think the obvious answer to that is, of course. I mean, you have, like you just said, most Kaiju Eiga fans' second favorite Kaiju being Mothra.
Mm-hmm.
Not on my personal list, but I do like Mothra. Um, and yeah, I mean, she's come back time and again within the Godzilla saga. She got her own trilogy of films in the kind of the mid to late 90s part. Quality of those is mixed, but they were more specifically kid films. Um, but this is a very popular character. Obviously, this film uh, was received very well. I know a lot of people in Japan love Mothra. A lot of people here in the United States love this character as well. It's kind of interesting because she's nothing more than a giant, colorful moth, but she's more than that, obviously. I mean, anybody who's watched these films knows that. And I think it's the beauty and the majesty of Earth and nature that is captured within her, the goodness within her as well, even though in this film that's kind of ambiguous. But there's kind of this mysticism about her as well. There's still a bit of a mystery. How did Mothra come to pass? By and large, we kind of know how Godzilla came to pass. By and large, we kind of know how Rodan did. Kind of, sort of, Iran as well, but there is some mystery of involved with Mothra as well, and I just think all of those combined have just made her a very popular and intriguing character amongst many Kaiju Eiga fans. So the legacy of this film obviously looms large.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer her appearance in a number of the Godzilla films to be better and superior in terms of overall film quality than what we get here. Again, that's not to it's not to step on the toes of this film. I still think it's a fairly good film. I just don't think it's great. But there's still a lot to love and enjoy about it. But this planted the seeds, and I think in some cases, obviously there are some exceptions, it got better.
Yeah, and especially too, along with with the obvious legacy of the creation of the character, uh, just what we discussed just not long before is the famous Mothra song or the chant and everything, and that kind of is sort of part of the entire Kaiju Iga sort of thing, or in particular with the Godzilla franchise, if you're a longtime fan or something, if you hear just maybe first few seconds or in the middle or something of the sort, you know who what that song belongs to, just like Godzilla's theme there. So yeah, definitely the character and the theme for the character has left quite a bit of the legacy, not only for just this film, but uh, for the entire Godzilla franchise as well.
Yeah, I mean this again, this is a legendary character, and regardless of what your opinions are about this particular movie, there's no doubt in my mind that I think all of us kaiju fans, especially those of us that are familiar with the Godzilla franchise, I'm willing to bet 99, if not even close to 100% of us have a favorite Godzilla film in our top five that includes Mothra in it. Um, I mean, this character, I mean, yes, part of it is because Mothra is inserted in a lot of them, but that's because, again, Mothra is a very popular character. So, yeah.
Hmm. And with that, with the rating out of 10 for this movie, what would you give it?
I think I give it an 8. I think it's a pretty solid film. There are just some things with the story, as I've talked about several times over the course of this discussion, that it's a little. Even though Mothra's name is mentioned, and we do see bits and pieces of her at various points during the film, especially once you get into the middle of it, um, it still is slightly jarring that this is considered a monster film just because of how the story itself is structured. But at the end, when you do get the Mothra the Mothra appearance and the destruction, it looks gorgeous and is fairly fun to watch. It's still not the most entertaining destruction sequence you're ever going to see. I tend to, on some level, have a slightly it was a bit different with Rodan because of how they had Rodan, both of them, well, at least one of them, land on the ground and do some destruction that way. But when you have flying creatures that are just overhead blowing winds and blowing stuff off, it looks good, but I get kind of bored with it because there's something more intriguing seeing a terrestrial organism walking through a large city, using their hands and legs and tails and all that stuff to destroy stuff. To me, when you have a flying, almost an exclusively flying kaiju, uh, flying and just using hurricane winds, at first it's kind of neat, but then it quickly gets tiring. So to me, the destruction, while the miniatures and all that are well put together, the entertainment value with some of that I don't think is as good. I think the larva Mothra destruction sequences are far better. The adult Mothra, not so much. I think they get old pretty quickly. I think by and large the story is pretty darn good. There are just some things that I'm kind of iffy about. But again, I still think it's a solid film. As time has gone on for 27 or so years, however long since I first saw this film, I started to like it a little bit more with time. Do I ever see this being in like my top, let's say, 10 kaiju films of all time? No, I don't. But I still think it's a fairly solid film. I think the acting is very good. Story is pretty decent. Effects, shots, by and large, exceptional. It's a solid film.
Hmm. Yeah, for me, um, on the rating out of 10, I would give this one a 7.5 out of 10. Just kind of sort of the similar uh, points that you were just pointing out there. But yeah, as far as you know, the portrayal of Mothra in this movie, it's kind of I think it's okay, um, but it's to me it's just sort of kind of out of character with the character, even though it's the first movie and and I think that they're trying to sort of get the hang of the character, even though I'm not entirely sure that they're gonna reuse her like they did in the later years after this film was released. But I would have to say that the human elements of the movie is really good, and I probably would say is probably the best parts of the movie. Um, but don't get me wrong, you know the kaiju sequences in this film is really good. Even the practical effects in there, and yeah, as far as the destructions in that one, I also tend to kind of be a little underwhelmed when it comes to the flying monsters and not, physically being down on the ground and ripping through buildings and skyscrapers and all the like. But just without uh, like the actual special effects of beams and everything, except for the masers and that are in this movie, I to me it's still pretty damn good for what they did with a minimal amount of like the special effect. And but as far as the matte screen, I think they could have improved that a little bit more, make it, I would say, better than what they did in the Rodan movie. Because to me, that as far as everything goes with that film, I think it's still a little bit superior movie over this one. But even uh, being how old this movie is, I think it's still aged pretty darn well, but not quite as good as the Rodan movie. But um, yeah, to me, I think uh, I would give this 7.5. I think is a pretty good area for this movie.
And with that, we thank you so much for joining us on our Daikaiju Fest panel of 60 Years of Mothra. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you continue to enjoy this year's Daikaiju Fest 2021.
And we'll see you guys in the next one.